Today, Howard University and the Department of Justice welcome you to the 50th anniversary celebration of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Preserving Progress, Chartering the Future. This program is being live streamed and videotaped by WHUT for broadcast on Sunday, July 20th at 6 p.m. Check www.whut.org for more information. At this time, we remind you to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. If at any time during the program you need assistance with seating or any other issues, please see the ushers located near the exits. If you are able, please rise for the singing of our national anthem to honor America and those who sacrificed for our freedoms.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave.
Thank you. Please be seated.
Congress passes the most sweeping civil rights bill ever to be written into the law, and thus reaffirms the conception of equality for all men that began with Lincoln and the Civil War 100 years ago. The Negro won his freedom then. He wins his dignity now. 5 hours after the House passes the measure, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who had labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions. Divisions which have lasted all too long. Its purpose is national, not regional. This Civil Rights Act is a challenge to all of us to go to work in our communities and our states, in our homes and in our hearts, to eliminate the last vestiges of injustice in our beloved country. So, tonight I urge every public official, every religious leader, every business and professional man, every working man, every housewife, I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people and to bring peace to our land.
There's warm applause from members of both parties as the president sets to work. It is work. He uses nearly 100 pens to affix his signature and date. Souvenirs go to Republican leader Everett Dirksen and Democratic whip Hubert Humphrey. The president seems to have mastered the art of just touching each pen to the paper. Integration leader Martin Luther King receives his pen, a gift he said he would cherish. The Department of Justice will enforce the law if necessary, and G-Man Chief J. Edgar Hoover is present. Another group of pens is reserved for the Kennedys, and the Attorney General is entrusted with a half dozen. Now, in this summer of 1964, the Civil Rights Bill is the law of the land. In the words of the President, it restricts no one's freedom so long as he respects the rights of others.
Please welcome the interim president of Howard University, Dr. Wayne A.I. Frederick.
Welcome. It is with great pride that I welcome our distinguished speakers, guests, and visitors to Howard University for the momentous celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It is an honor for Howard University to join the Department of Justice in hosting this symposium, which will explore the history and future of this groundbreaking legislation. It is my pleasure to acknowledge the following individuals and groups for their attendance and contributions to today's program. Our esteemed program guests, cabinet members, including those whom we are honored to have on our program today, Attorney General Holder, Secretary Perez, and Secretary Duncan. White House officials, members of Congress and other elected officials, leaders at the various federal agencies that are represented today, leaders and stakeholders from the civil rights community, National Archives for displaying the original Civil Rights Act, and the distinguished members of the Howard University community, faculty, students, staff, and alumni. The long road to passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was paved with the footsteps of countless ordinary Americans and well-known civil rights leaders who marched, held sit-ins, staged boycotts, and led freedom rides to end segregation and discrimination. The call for comprehensive civil rights legislation gained momentum in 1963 as civil rights activists continued to organize peaceful demonstrations throughout the country. After hundreds of nonviolent protesters were met with police violence and arrest in Birmingham, Alabama, President John F. Kennedy delivered a nationally televised speech voicing his support for comprehensive civil rights legislation. After President Kennedy's assassination in November of 1963, President Lyndon B. Johnson made a commitment to pursue passage of civil rights legislation. And after the longest debate in Senate history, the Civil Rights Act was finally passed and signed into law, becoming the first of many legislative victories over the next 50 years that have been critical tools for protecting civil rights. Throughout the past 50 years, our university has been grounded by the legacy rendered by the outcomes of the dedicated commitment of countless locals as well as national civil rights activists. Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on July 2, 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed discriminatory voting requirements and segregation in schools, employment, and places of public accommodation. Today's keynote speaker, Attorney General Eric Holder, has made protecting civil rights a top priority of his administration of the Department of Justice. Howard University awarded President Lyndon Johnson an honorary Doctor of Laws degree at our June 5, 1965 commencement convocation. In his commencement address, he offered the following insight about the future path of civil rights in our country. It is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This is the next and a more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result. I believe that the presentations and discussions in today's symposium highlight the critical importance of the ongoing work that must continue to guarantee justice and civil rights for all citizens. As we reflect on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, we celebrate the activists whose sacrifices paved the road toward equality. Their unwavering commitment strengthened our nation and inspires us to persist. Let us rededicate our efforts to preserve the gains of the past 50 years and advance a robust agenda for the future. We must obsess about the journey and not any specific destination. The passage of the Civil Rights Act was a destination, an important one albeit, but not a final one. Like the virtue of love, this is a journey without an end. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you today the Attorney General, Eric Holder. Eric Holder Jr. was sworn in as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States on February 3, 2009 by Vice President Joe Biden. President Barack Obama announced his intention to nominate Mr. Holder on December 1, 2008. In 1997, Mr. Holder was named by President Clinton to be the Deputy Attorney General, the first African-American named to that post. Prior to that, he served as U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia. In 1988, Mr. Holder was nominated by President Reagan to become an Associate Judge of the Supreme Court of the District of Columbia. While in law school, Mr. Holder clerked at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Department of Justice's Criminal Division. Upon graduating, he moved to Washington and joined the Department of Justice as part of the Attorney General's Honors Program. He was assigned to the newly formed Public Integrity Section in 1976 and was asked to investigate and prosecute official corruption on the local, state, and federal levels. As Attorney General, Mr. Holder has made the protection of civil rights one of the highest priorities of the Department of Justice. And so it is my distinct pleasure to welcome to the podium the Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder Jr. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Ron? Thank you. All right. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you, President Frederick, for those kind words, and thank you all for such a warm welcome. It's a pleasure to be here on the beautiful and historic campus of Howard University, one of our nation's great historically black institutions of higher learning and home to generations of leaders and role models. I'd like to thank the Howard University Color Guard for being a part of this celebration, and Bert Cross for that exceptional rendition of the national anthem. I'm glad I didn't have to come immediately after him. I also want to recognize Ambassador Andrew Young, a tireless advocate for the rights of all Americans and a proud graduate of this university. And I also want to thank every member of the Gay Men's Chorus who will share their talents with us later this morning for helping to make this event so special. I'm also mindful as we gather today of the leader that we lost this past Friday. John Siegenthaler was a passionate journalist, a lifelong defender of the First Amendment, and a fierce civil rights advocate. He was a top aide to my predecessor as Attorney General, Robert F. Kennedy, and later served as his pallbearer. He risked his life alongside the Freedom Riders and called forcefully for civil rights protections at a time when most Southern journalists turned a blind eye. He was a truly remarkable man and a singular voice for the cause of justice, a guiding light and an inspiration to many, including me. I count myself as extremely fortunate to have known John Siegenthaler, and I extend my heartfelt condolences to his family. He will be dearly missed, but his critical work goes on. Now, it is a privilege to be among so many distinguished guests, including fellow members of the President's Cabinet, Howard faculty and administrators, accomplished trailblazers in the fight for civil rights, and young people who will carry on the work that we commemorate and build on the singular achievement that we celebrate here today. Half a century ago this month, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at his side, President Lyndon Johnson marked an inflection point in a struggle that predated our republic when he signed the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was a struggle that had begun more than 3 centuries earlier, in 1619, with the arrival of roughly 20 captive Africans in Jamestown, Virginia. And it continued through the expanding colonization of North America. By 1763, the colonial population included roughly 300,000 Africans, the overwhelming majority of whom were slaves. Yet it wasn't until a century later that our greatest president issued an Emancipation Proclamation providing a legal framework for the eventual release of many slaves and secured the 13th Amendment, which finally struck this evil from our Constitution. But even then, Jim Crow laws and other measures were engineered to keep millions of African Americans effectively in bondage, slavery by another name, for a century more. And intimidation and violence were routinely employed to prevent them from becoming educated, to keep us from voting, and to stop them, us, from mixing with the white majority. Finally, 60 years ago this May, when Chief Justice Earl Warren led a unanimous Supreme Court to declare in Brown versus the Board of Education that segregation was unconstitutional, our nation took an important step to reconcile not only 2 races, but 2 histories, 2 Americas that had been intensely separate and profoundly unequal since long before the American Revolution. And 10 long years after that, as long simmering injustice gave way to activism and principled action, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was adopted to forever enshrine American equality into American law. This historic measure barred discrimination based on race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. It instituted critical employment protections. It outlawed discrimination in public accommodations, including schools and workplaces, and prohibited unequal application of voter requirements. In so doing, it greatly expanded the mandate of the department's Civil Rights Division, which is to this day committed to enforcing the Civil Rights Act and upholding the civil and constitutional rights of all Americans, particularly society's most vulnerable members. The new statute also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, as well as the Community Relations Service, which assists vulnerable populations and promotes healing in times of disorder and in times of distress. Now, securing this law was an extraordinary undertaking, born of a consensus wrought by decades of hard work and profound sacrifice. It required 2 great presidents, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, who called on us to confront a moral crisis and fulfill a national promise, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who took action after President Kennedy's assassination to make that promise real. It required a Congress with the fortitude to stand up to those who defended a way of life that was founded on bigotry and founded on oppression. It required leaders of conviction, from Medgar Evers to Dr. King, from John Lewis to Andrew Young, to Julian Bond, to Charlene Hunter Galt, who were willing to risk and even to give their lives in order that others might live free. And most of all, it required men, women, and even children of tremendous courage and unwavering faith to endure the unendurable and advance the cause of justice. These are the heroes whose legacy we celebrate on this milestone anniversary. These are the pioneers on whose shoulders we now stand, and these are the trailblazers to whom we pay grateful tribute this morning. Of course, like all who are old enough to remember those days when northern cities erupted and when Mississippi burned, I will never forget the turmoil and the violence that characterized the civil rights era. I will never forget watching on a black and white television in my childhood home in East Elmhurst, Queens, New York City, as countless people, rich and poor, black and white, famous and unknown, braved dogs and fire hoses, billy clubs and baseball bats, bullets and bombs, in order to secure the rights to which every American is entitled. These extraordinary citizens streamed into Birmingham and marched on Washington. They stood up in Little Rock and they sat in Greensboro. They faced riots in Oxford and they walked through a schoolhouse door in Tuscaloosa. They dared, during America's long night of racial injustice, to dream of a more equal society. And they risked everything. They risked everything they had to make it so. That was the fight that half a century ago brought nearly 1,000 students to Mississippi for a voter registration campaign called Freedom Summer. As the battle for civil rights was waged in the halls of Congress and thundered across the streets of America, inch by inch, the nation as a whole moved slowly towards equality. But Mississippi and other states continued to stand in stubborn, racist opposition. Registrar offices instituted voting tests and other measures that made it almost impossible for black men and women to go to the polls and vote. Citizens and even some sworn police officers fought racial equality and threatened African Americans who dared stop and step into voting booths. Newspapers published the names of registered black voters so they could be targeted and terrorized by those who harbored hatred. Yet, hundreds of young people came to Mississippi in defiance of these threats and in the face of deadly violence to help extend our democracy's most basic right to people of color. In the 10 weeks of Freedom Summer, more than 65 buildings were bombed or burned. Hundreds of civil rights workers were beaten and arrested. And 3 brave young men, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and Michael Schwerner, were brutally murdered. Yet violence did not send the activists running, as its perpetrators had hoped. Instead, it galvanized them, and it galvanized our nation. More and more brave Americans joined the cause, both residents of these communities and students of all races from across the country. When they saw that African Americans were being deprived of quality educational opportunities, they established freedom schools to teach black history, to facilitate discussion, and to encourage political activism. These young people devoted themselves to the hope, as Michael Schwerner's widow Rita once wrote, that they could pass on to the next generation a world containing more respect for the dignity and worth of all men than that world which was willed to us. The senseless murders of Rita's husband and his 2 colleagues, one black and one white, in a case that became known as Mississippi Burning, captured headlines and sparked outrage across the country. Their tragic deaths moved public opinion, spurred cautious politicians to take long overdue action, and intensified support for the Civil Rights Act. But their efforts also made possible the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, along with countless other movements for progress. And although Michael and Rita Schwerner never had the chance to have children of their own, their work and the efforts of their friends and fellows left a better world for me and for my children and for millions more. As we mark this anniversary, I am especially mindful that without the Civil Rights Act, the protections it codified, or the monumental progress that followed, few of us would be here this morning. And without the sacrifices of countless activists and citizens, I would not stand before you as Attorney General of the United States, proudly serving in the administration of our first African American president. I am just as mindful that none of this progress was preordained. We know from our history that advances towards equality and inclusion have never been inevitable. Every step forward has been hard-won. The words of our founding documents were not automatically imbued with the force of law, and our nation's future continues to be defined and its destiny determined by men and women of both character and conviction, by courageous people who are unafraid to stand up for what they know to be right, and by patriots who never shrink from the responsibility to draw this country ever closer to its highest ideals. Now, like you, my colleagues at every level of today's Department of Justice and I are determined to do everything in our power to further these efforts, to protect and expand the work of those who have gone before, and to extend America's promise to new generations and populations that have been too long disenfranchised, overlooked, and oppressed. Half a century after its passage, the Civil Rights Act continues to provide an arsenal of singularly useful tools in waging this struggle. And as we speak, the Justice Department is using provisions of this important law both aggressively and innovatively to confront civil rights challenges old and civil rights challenges new. Earlier this year, our Civil Rights Division relied on the 1964 Act to reach a $99 million employment discrimination settlement with the New York City Fire Department, the largest such settlement to date, ensuring that all applicants can fairly compete for jobs and that New Yorkers, my hometown, are protected by the best qualified among them. In 2012, the department used provisions of the Act to address harassment against lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students in a Minnesota school district, establishing a model for other districts to follow. We are currently employing other provisions to fight for gender equality in education and in the workplace. And we're finding that in a variety of cases and circumstances, from ensuring that schools provide safe and equal opportunities to all of our sons and daughters, to guaranteeing access to state courts for those with limited English proficiency, the Civil Rights Act offers powerful enforcement authorities to address contemporary challenges and safeguard vulnerable people. Beyond the Act itself, the Justice Department has worked with our partners throughout the administration, most notably the Department of Education, led by Secretary Arne Duncan, and the Department of Labor, led by Secretary Tom Perez, who not long ago led and in fact helped to revive our own Civil Rights Division, ushering in what I'm confident will be considered an era of historic achievement for that division. Alongside these other agencies, we have worked hard to build on the spirit of the law by winning new legislation and judicial rulings that extend the promise of equality to others. We've secured additional protections for women, Latinos, Asian Americans, American Indians, and people with disabilities. And we've achieved historic progress in ensuring the civil rights of LGBT individuals across the country so they can finally receive equal opportunities, equal protection, and equal treatment that they deserve. All of this is important, life-changing work. It speaks to the timelessness of the Civil Rights Act itself, the continuing relevance of its core provisions, and the need to keep expanding upon the safeguards that it provides. But it also shows that our work is far from over. Significant challenges remain before us, and each one of us, every American, has a great deal more to do. Although we can be proud of the progress that's been made, even within our own lifetimes, we cannot accept these advances as an indication that our work is complete, that our long journey has been successfully concluded. Progress is not an end. It is a measure of effort and of commitment. As we speak, in far too many neighborhoods, far too many people of color and far too many LGBT individuals are denied credit and housing. In the workplace, far too many women are deprived of the opportunity to perform equal work for equal pay, earning on average only 77 cents for every dollar earned by their male colleagues. In our education system, students of color are far more likely than white children to attend poorly funded schools. In the criminal justice system, African American men are routinely subjected to sentences averaging 20% longer than those served by white men convicted of similar crimes. And when it comes to our most treasured democratic institution, many vulnerable populations, including young people, the elderly, and communities of color, are now facing a range of new restrictions leveled under the dubious guise of voter fraud prevention that create significant barriers to the ballot box. If these and other conditions, from lower social and economic mobility to reduced educational opportunities to unequal justice on unfair outcomes, or felt so acutely by the majority of Americans, I believe our national dialogue and our response to these problems would be very different. As it stands, our society is not yet colorblind, nor should it be, given the disparities that still afflict and divide us. We must be color brave and must never forget that all are made better and more prosperous if all are given equal opportunities. So that's why today, together, we must resolve once again to act not out of self-interest, but out of national interest. We must take into account not only the considerable steps forward that we've seen over the last 50 years, but the entirety of the experience that people of color have faced. And we must never hesitate to confront the fact that this undeniable truth that in too many places across this nation that I love and that I've served throughout my life, that the echoes of injustices stretching back nearly 4 centuries continue to reverberate. These echoes from times past are still heard by too many they're still heard by too many in our nation today. Now, in addressing these lingering effects, there is a need for personal responsibility. Too many individuals act in ways that are negligent or counterproductive. But there's also a need for societal responsibility, for collective engagement and common effort. We must be willing to acknowledge the problems that we face, to talk frankly about inequality, and to examine its causes and its impacts, and most importantly, to ultimately eradicate it. And we must look at our great nation and reflect on its history with clarity and with painful honesty, with open eyes and deep understanding of who we have been, who we aspire to be, and who we are today. This is the key to perfecting our union and formulating policies that will lead to a better, brighter future for all of our citizens. This is what drives the Obama administration's sweeping efforts to ensure that every American has the chance to succeed based on his or her skills, talent, and potential, and not by the circumstances of their birth. But this is something that we'll never be able to do on our own. Today, I'm calling on Congress to renew the spirit of the Civil Rights Act by updating fair housing and lending laws to address discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, and marital status. By strengthening workplace protections to prohibit pay discrimination against women and to finally end discrimination against LGBT citizens by ensuring equal access to education and promoting non-discriminatory learning environments, and by passing updated voting rights legislation that will enable every voter in every jurisdiction to exercise unencumbered the rights that so many have fought for and died to defend. After all, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was an attempt, and a highly successful one, to confront fundamental questions that had bedeviled this nation since its inception, and that justifiably generate controversy even today. This morning, we are reminded that carrying on this work, advancing the cause of justice, and ensuring the civil and human rights of every person, no matter where they come from, no matter who they are, no matter who they love, continues to constitute our most solemn obligation. The true greatness of this country lies in our limitless capacity for innovation and invention, for rebirth and for renewal, for forging greater societies and reaching new frontiers. As a people, we have never been content to tie ourselves to an unjust status quo, no matter how many individuals may have found it acceptable. We challenge, we question, We struggle, we quarrel. We bind ourselves to the ongoing quest for a better future. And ultimately, we move forward together as one nation, indivisible, driven by our pursuit of a more perfect union and determined, come what may, to achieve it. That, at its core, is what defines us as Americans, a people born of revolution and tested by civil war, a nation founded on equality, but built by those in chains, a country first imagined centuries ago by imperfect people driven by a near-perfect vision, a vision conceived by patriots who dared to reach beyond themselves and defended later by activists who fought for equal justice and who challenge us even today to make this promise real. To them, as to generations yet to come, we owe our best efforts and our deepest resolve. We must take up this challenge and implement this vision. And we must build, in their honor, a world that is worthy of their passion, their sacrifice, and their humanity. Now, like you, I have no illusions that this task will be easy. But as I look around this crowd today of passionate men and women dedicated to truth and devoted to service, I'm really confident of our ability to reach that promised land. I thank you for your commitment to progress and to the pursuit of justice. And I look forward to all that we must and will accomplish in the months and in the years ahead. As a nation, as the beloved community, as a united people, we shall overcome. Thank you. Thank you.
Please welcome the Deputy Attorney General of the United States Department of Justice, James M. Cole.
History is not just a series of events. It's the people who create those events. It's the impact of the stories, told and untold, of the many trailblazers and unsung heroes whose tireless sacrifices and relentless dedication have resulted in justice, equality, opportunity, and freedom for all. Looking back, we have seen that the defining moments in American history resulted from the strategic, dedicated, and tremendous hard work of risk-takers, of visionaries, of leaders. Leaders like Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, who refused to accept an unjust status quo. Civil rights pioneers like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Reverends Ralph Abernathy and Joseph Lowery, Congressman John Lewis, Rosa Parks, and many of today's program participants and guests. And many of you in this auditorium, as well as countless others who, in the face of bigotry and violence, called upon our nation to live up to its fundamental ideals of liberty and equality. History is Ambassador Andrew Jackson Young, Jr., a living legend and an icon at the forefront of a watershed moment for America, one with enormous ramifications for our country and the world, the Civil Rights Movement, and the ultimate passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Ambassador Young met the challenges of segregation and discrimination with truly remarkable sacrifices, helping to transform America into a better, a stronger, and a fairer nation. Born in New Orleans, Louisiana, during the depths of the Great Depression and Jim Crow segregation, Ambassador Young accepted the responsibility of service at a young age. In 1960, after receiving his undergraduate degree right here at Howard University, and his divinity degree from Hartford Theological Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut, he joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Atlanta-based civil rights organization led by Dr. King. He was soon named the director of SCLC's Citizenship School program, where he, like Dr. King, employed Mahatma Gandhi's concept of nonviolent resistance as an organizing strategy and tactic for social change. Later, after becoming the executive director of the SCLC, Ambassador Young quickly became one of Dr. King's most trusted advisors and confidants. He was one of the principal strategists and negotiators during the civil rights campaigns in Birmingham, Selma, and Atlanta, to name just a few. And it was those campaigns, along with other critical events, that led to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Even after being beaten and jailed for his participation in civil rights demonstrations, and after witnessing the devastating assassination of Dr. King in 1968, the ambassador's leadership and devotion to public service, to social justice, and to human rights never wavered. In 1972, he became the first African American from the Deep South since Reconstruction to be elected to the United States Congress. In 1977, he became the first African American to serve as our ambassador to the United Nations. And in 1981, he was elected mayor of the great city of Atlanta, where he served for 2 terms. In Atlanta, where he resides today, Ambassador Young has continued his service to the civil rights cause as a college professor at Georgia State University, where the Policy School is named in his honor. He has also established the Andrew Young Foundation, and he has remained active in local, national, and global affairs. In recognition of his vast contributions, Ambassador Young was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award that the United States has to bestow. And he has received honorary degrees from more than 100 colleges and universities in the United States and abroad. And just when you thought that his inventory of accomplishments could not extend any further, Ambassador Young has earned the title of filmmaker, devoted husband, Emmy Award winner, author, and proud father and grandfather. Ambassador Young, on behalf of a grateful nation and everyone here today, I want to thank you for your remarkable service, not only to our country, but to the world. Your work, along with the historic efforts of others, laid the groundwork for what has become a significant part of the Justice Department's mission: to expand opportunity for all people, to safeguard the fundamental infrastructure of our democracy, and to protect the most vulnerable among us. Our commitment to advancing this work has never been stronger. All of us, together, must continue moving our nation forward toward a more perfect union, one that reflects the values and the principles enshrined in our nation's founding documents. And your participation here this morning serves as an inspiration for this important work. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming an ambassador for change, an ambassador for equality, and an ambassador for justice, Ambassador Andrew Young.
Thank you very much. That was an extremely generous introduction. But I want to come back to my days at Howard University and days before Howard University, because it was in 1941 that my 6th grade teacher took me to a federal courthouse, and I saw a tall, skinny young lawyer by the name of Thurgood Marshall argue the case of the equalization of teachers' salaries in Louisiana, 1941. Already, Howard University had started through its law school laying the groundwork for what was to come. Before that, Ralph Bunch, one of our professors, was asked to do the intelligence network to try to understand how America should relate to Africa during the Second World War. Remember, the South Africans were supporting Hitler. And Ralph Bunche in 1937 to 1939 took a leave of absence from Howard University and spent 2 years trying to figure out the world. But in the process, he figured out the United Nations. And I really think that Ralph Bunche probably has more to do with every word in the United Nations Charter and every institution of the United Nations that still exists today. I'm saying without Howard University, without Thurgood Marshall, Spotswood Robinson, Judge Hastie, and many others, we wouldn't have had any basis for marching. I got out of here 63 years ago. And I said, Lord, if you give me one more chance, I promise you I'll do better. But I didn't know what had happened to me here. I say I neglected my studies and none of my teachers knew my name. But I got one hell of an education. And don't play yourselves cheap and don't let anyone else define you. Now let me go to December 17th, 1962. Fred Shuttlesworth's church was bombed. It was bombed for the third time in the last 18 months. There were 60 unsolved bombings of homes where nobody had ever been charged or investigated. Fred Shuttlesworth came to see Martin Luther King the next day or so and said, well, first of all, the house came completely down and everybody was sure that Fred was dead. And he walks out of there with his shirt and tie on and says, if this didn't kill me, I can do anything I want to do. So he came to Atlanta and got us to say that we couldn't sit back and wait for desegregation. We couldn't continue to be passively nonviolent. There had to be an aggressive nonviolent movement, much to my surprise, because Martin Luther King was really no militant. But on this occasion, he said, yes, we must. I said, oh, Lord. But we ended up going to Birmingham a few months later, and we had a plan to confront segregation. And you heard about the dogs, and you heard about the jailings, and you heard about the fire hoses. That wasn't it. The plan was that 300,000 citizens of color would not spend a nickel on anything but food or medicine until the economy changed. And so Birmingham was an economic movement more than a marching movement. And when you pull 300,000 citizens out of the economy, everybody was underwater. And my job was to try to negotiate with them to help them to realize that it was really not going to get any better unless they took down the signs, they allowed people to work. And they said, well, we can't find anybody qualified. We said, no, that's not true. The maids that you have wearing those white embarrassing suits, no more than the young ladies that you have coming in from Auburn and Alabama about your departments. Go home and talk to your wives. See who they come to when they want to shop at your store and want to know where something is. They don't go to the clerks, they go to the maids. They're running your business anywhere. Anyway, and so we ended up one by one helping them overcome the obstacles. There's no such thing as white water and black water. Take that signs down. If people want to drink, they drink. If they don't want to drink, they don't drink. It was really very simple, but only because we refuse to cooperate with injustice. And in that non-cooperation, we slowly but surely refashioned a society. And that's about the time the Community Relations Service was born. It wasn't called that then, but it was really Bert Marshall and Bill Vanden Heuvel and others from the Justice Department that while we were talking with businessmen on one side, they were talking with businessmen on the other side. That it was not a children's crusade. The people that we organized to go to jail were juniors and seniors in high school who would have been going to Vietnam in another year had they graduated. So for us, it said, why not stand up for freedom in your own hometown, because you're not going to have a choice. So the president of the student body, the captain of the football team, the leader of the band, a key group of leaders from each high school went to jail early in April. They went to jail to have an experience. They had a religious experience. They went to jail with the ministers and members of the civil rights movement. When they came out, they were changed. And their purpose was to organize their high schools for D-Day, which was May the 5th, 1963. On May the 5th, 1963, every high school in Birmingham and surrounding counties closed down. The principals locked the gates, they pushed the gates down. They walked, some of them as many as 20 and 25 miles to get to the center of Birmingham to get to jail. By that time, everybody knew it was all over. And so the Justice Department was able, in 1963, to get 100 businessmen to sign an agreement that met the challenges that had been offered by Fred Shuttlesworth in the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. 100 businessmen signed that, even though it was against George Wallace's law. But it worked. It changed. People suddenly acted different. And we never even had any problems at the lunch counters. And the reason was that the South was basically very comfortable racially. But for a few hoodlums, and once the established citizens and good folk reined in the few hoodlums, we were able to move forward. And with the help of a really courageous Congress and the coming together of the churches, the business community, behind the Congress and the president, we were able to pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But don't forget that the 100 businessmen agreed to it a year before the Congress passed. So when I said that to Harry Oppenheimer in South Africa, he said, "Do you think that would work in South Africa?" So I said, sure. Anytime 100 businessmen decide that they are going to change the society, and they're far more vulnerable than congressmen. It takes 50% to change, 51% to change a congressman. You hit a businessman in his pocketbook for 10% and you got his soul. At least his attention. And so we took some of the same ideas into South Africa and all around the world. And so I say that you are a part of changing history. But we did only 2/3 of our promise. Dr. King's mandate was to redeem the soul of America from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. Now, racism is not gone, but it's illegal. And war is not gone, but you cannot say that there is a big difference between 66 million people killed in the Second World War and the 5,000 to 6,000 that the president has been able to to limit in Afghanistan, and that we have a president that is following up as best he can some of the values that we have evolved out of this institution, out of this movement, to help make the world a better place. The one thing we did not do, and we do not yet understand, is poverty. We were redeeming the world from the triple evils of racism, war, and poverty. We didn't understand poverty because we don't understand economics. The economics that you all are probably being taught is probably irrelevant to the future of the world in which we live. Now, get mad if you want to, but think about it. You're talking about nationalist European economics in a global economy where they can transfer more wealth over a cell phone than existed at the time your textbooks were written. So think, take us to this next stage. And I challenge you to let the leadership for a global vision of a global economy that feeds the hungry, that clothes the naked, that heals the sick, that sets at liberty those who are oppressed. I hope somehow, from some of your minds and souls and spirits, that kind of economy might emerge in our lifetime. God bless you.
Under the direction of Thea Kano, performing the selection, Make Them Hear You, please welcome to the stage the Gay Men's Chorus of Washington, D.C.
Make them hear you. Make them hear you. How justice was our battle, and how justice was denied. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And say to those who blame us for the way we chose to fight, that sometimes there are battles which are more than black or white. And I could not put down my sword when justice was my right. Make them hear you. Make them hear. Tell our story to your daughters and your sons. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. And tell them in a struggle we were not the only ones. Make them hear you. Make them hear you. Your sword can be a sermon or the power of the pen. Teach every child to raise his voice, and then, my brothers, then will justice be demanded by 10 million righteous men. Make them hear you. When they hear you, I'll be near you again.
Wigglesworth had been right. When the movement came to Birmingham, it won a much-needed victory, and it gained national attention.
Lunch counters and fittings.
The next night, the Ku Klux Klan met outside the city, and Grand Dragon Robert Shelton gave this opinion of the Birmingham Agreement.
No business people in Birmingham or any other city has the authority to attempt any type of negotiation when it deals in governmental affairs of a municipality. Martin Luther King, in my opinion, epitaph can be written here in Birmingham.
Several hours later, a bomb exploded outside Martin Luther King's room at the Gaston Motel. King had already left Birmingham, and no one was in the room at the time. As a large crowd gathered, the Alabama State Police moved in and began beating blacks with clubs and rifles. In response, angry blacks rioted and set fire to several buildings. Over the next few weeks, the riots that began in Birmingham spread to other cities. Racial tensions gripped the country, and President Kennedy was moved to action. On June 11th, he took a stronger position than any president since Lincoln, calling civil rights a moral issue.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city, north and south. Where legal remedies are not at hand, redress is sought in the streets, in demonstrations, parades, and protests, which create tensions and threaten violence and threaten lives. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Kennedy pushed for a new civil rights bill, but was troubled when the movement announced plans for a mass march on Washington. Fearing more violence, Attorney General Robert Kennedy had tried to prevent the march without success.
There will be a mass march, there is no doubt about that. And it is our purpose and it is our hope that this march will carry on in a manner that will be definitely and effectively in support of the civil rights program.
Freedom Now movement, hear me. We are requesting all citizens to move into Washington.
The movement that had learned to mobilize communities now set about trying to mobilize a nation. Across the country, people made plans to attend the March on Washington, demonstrating for jobs and freedom. Among the thousands who traveled to Washington, there were black and white activists, labor leaders, clergy, and Hollywood stars.
They came from every state. They came in jalopies, on trains, buses, anything they could get. Some walked.
Bayard Rustin was the master organizer behind the day's events, coordinating hundreds of details. Volunteers painted signs to state the issues. They made 80,000 cheese sandwiches to feed the marchers. Security was carefully set up so violence would not mar the day. As the day began, march organizers worried that the turnout would not be large enough to attract the nation's attention. By early afternoon, more than 200,000 people gathered for the symbolic march from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. It was a triumphant day for Mr. Randolph, who had first proposed the idea for such a march in 1941 during Franklin Roosevelt's administration. But there was trouble behind the scenes as the marchers gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. The White House was upset about a speech that was to be given by John Lewis, National Chairman for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee.
Please welcome to the stage our panelists who will discuss the impact of the Civil Rights Acts of 1964. Former chairman of the NAACP and civil rights activist, Mr. Julian Bond. Civil rights activist and freedom rider, Ms. Joanne Trumpower Mulholland. National editor and political correspondent for Vanity Fair, Mr. Todd Purdom. Civil rights activist and journalist, Ms. Helen Zia. Howard University School of Law's Associate Dean for Academic Affairs, Lisa Crones Robbins. And our moderator, a former journalist for the New York Times and two-time Emmy Award winner, Ms. Charlene Hunter Galt.
Hello, everybody. I want to begin by asking that they bring me a chair. There's no chair out here, but I'm happy to stand. I also want to begin on a point of personal privilege. I cannot be as eloquent as my good brother, Andy Young, but I'm here too because of what Howard University professors enabled for me. I am a child of Brown, and the reason I can stand here today as a journalist with many years' experience in every medium is because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Therefore, I would like to begin with my dear friend and former brother in the civil rights movement, Julian Bond. Julian, you began in Nashville, I think, and then moved to Atlanta, where I was, at the time I was a high school student, so you're a couple of years older than I am, I think. Tell me how you entered this journey that resulted in the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
This is not going to be as long a story as it could be.
Yeah, my instructions to the panel was to be pithy and brief.
In 1960, I was a student at Morehouse College in Atlanta and spending a lot of time in Yates and Milton's drugstore, a place where we went between classes or instead of classes. And another student came up to me, a fellow named Lonnie King, whom I knew only as a football player at Morehouse. And he held up a newspaper and he said, "Have you seen this?" I thought he was asking, "Do you read the newspaper?" And I felt a little put out by that question. He said, "No, I mean this story." And he pointed to a story that said Greensboro students sit in for third day. And he said, "Have you seen this?" I said, "Yes, I have." He said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "Oh, it's great, it's wonderful." He said, "Don't you think it ought to happen here in Atlanta?" I said, "Oh, it's going to happen here in Atlanta." And he said, "Why don't we make it happen here?" And before I could say, "What do you mean we?" he said, "You take this side of the cafe, I'll take the other side, and we'll call a meeting to discuss this." And in a few minutes, we had talked to a number of people, and we made sure that we had somebody from Spelman, from Morehouse, from Clark, from all of the schools of the Atlanta University Center, and created this movement. And in a few weeks, we were sitting in. That was it.
But that was pithy and that was brief, but I want a little bit more. That was not an easy time that you had as the head, as one of the principals in the, what did you call it, the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. You made demands and you stood and took the brutality of the resistors in Atlanta. Tell us just briefly about that, and be pithy.
Well, before we began sitting in Atlanta, we had been approached by Rufus Clement, who was the president of Atlanta University and sort of the de facto president of all of the schools. And he had told us that we ought to tell Atlanta why we were sitting in, although we thought it was pretty obvious we were sitting in because we wanted to eat at these lunch counters. But he really had a higher purpose in mind, and he urged us to write a statement, which we did, called An Appeal for Human Rights. And with money gotten from Lillian Smith, famous writer of the time and period, a racial liberal, she gave us enough money to put a full-page ad in the Atlanta Journal, the Atlanta Constitution, and the Atlanta Daily World of this big proclamation called An Appeal for Human Rights, and it listed the arguments we had with segregation, what living in a segregated world meant to us, and closed by saying we're committed to doing everything we can nonviolently to change these subjects. We printed this in the 3 daily papers, and it caused a kind of a stir in Atlanta. Black Atlanta loved it. White Atlanta had mixed opinions. The governor of Georgia, Ernest Vandiver, said, "This is not written by students. It sounds as though it had been written in Moscow or Peking." Now, I have never been to Moscow or Peking, and I wrote some of this statement, so I was really put off by that. And so that was an announcement of what we planned to do, and then we had these sit-in demonstrations, and it was the first time I got arrested, and most of us getting arrested then for the first time, and we just created a beginning of a movement. Then we got a letter from a woman named Ella Baker and from Dr. King. And of course, we knew who Dr. King was, but we weren't sure who is this woman, Ella Baker. We later found out that she had played a behind-the-scenes role in civil rights activity for decades and decades before we met her. And we got an invitation to come to a meeting with other students from around the South in Raleigh, North Carolina at Shaw University. And a group of us borrowed a car and drove up there and had a wonderful time because we saw people in Shaw whom we'd only seen on TV before. And these are people like ourselves, black students from historically black colleges, public and private, who had sat in as we had sat in Atlanta. And it was just wonderful to be in touch with these young people and to know that there were others like ourselves. And we were told by the NAACP, or asked by the NAACP, Dr. King's organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, that we ought to join them. And we thought to ourselves, well, why would we join you? Because you didn't do what we did, so why should we be a part of you? And Ms. Baker convinced us that we ought to have something independent of our own, and so we created our own organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and we elected...
SNCC, the shock troops of the movement.
Yes, and we elected... we elected Marion Barry as our chairman, a wise move, and we created an organization that was fast-moving, could move like that, and could take risk and chances because we were young, because we didn't have mortgages, we didn't have rent payments, we didn't have car payments. We were relatively independent people, and so we could do what we wanted to, and we did.
Well, let me ask you very briefly, you didn't have your eye on the Civil Rights Act at that point. This was about 1959. These were local things that you were trying to change, the white water and the black water, and the white toilets and the black toilets, right? I mean, it was local.
Yes, exactly so. We were interested in things we could see and things that were objectionable to us right there in Atlanta. And those are the things we wanted to change.
Tell us quickly, what was your biggest victory?
Biggest victory, I think, was when Rich's department store, which was the biggest department store in Atlanta, agreed to give in.
Going back to Andy's point, you touch the businessman, you've got a victory.
Indeed, so Richard Rich was the owner of Rich's department store, And he said to us at one meeting, he said, I don't care if another Negro ever comes in my store. We said, hey, we'll show you. And we made sure, as Andy said, that Negroes did not come in his store, and he just couldn't take it, and he gave in. And because he was a leader of the commercial community, other people followed him, and it just bam, bam, bam was over then.
Right, and there's much more to SNCC, but we'll get back to that later. Joan Trumpier-Mulholland, you were one of the white entrants into the Freedom Rides. Tell us about that. I mean, this was, at this point, primarily, when you entered, a black movement. So how did you get in there?
Well, I got into the sit-ins down in Durham, North Carolina, when at our Sunday church group at Duke, we got told that there would be some students who were involved in the sit-ins and the pickets. They'd be coming to our next meeting. Keep it quiet. You don't want the police to show up. You don't want the administration to lock you out. You don't want the local rowdies to inflict violence.
What year was this?
Pardon?
What year was this?
This was probably April of 1960 when the sit-ins had started. Sorry. And so these well-dressed, well-spoken students from North Carolina College came over and explained to us on the legal basis and the moral basis for the sit-ins, and then they invited us to join them. So we did.
It was just that easy?
Just that easy.
Why?
Well,
you didn't come out of a tradition of things being just that easy
well,
for
now,
white
my
people.
great-grandmother in Iowa was amongst a bunch of suffragettes who had chained themselves to the railings at the Capitol. So I expect something in the back of my mind went into civil disobedience. But actually, I think my motivation to join the civil rights movement came from being a Southerner and seeing the inequities, and particularly when I was 10 years old down at Grandma's in Oconee, Georgia. We got a lot of Georgia connections going here, folks. Mary, who I played with every summer, we sort of dared each other to go walk through the black area of Oconee. And these two little white girls, about 10 years old, went walking down the road, and everyone just sort of melded into the woodwork. But seeing the school, the one-room school with a pot-bellied stove and an outhouse, and comparing that to what I knew was the white school, all brick and new, that was just in-your-face inequity. And combine that with my Sunday school, memorizing those verses about doing unto others and all, I knew I had to do what I could as a Southerner to help make the South the best it could be.
So you went on one of the first Freedom Rides. You were arrested. I heard you talk about this yesterday. But you talked about being in jail like it was being at a pep rally.
Well, now, it wasn't the first time I'd been in jail. I'd had a little experience in Durham. I think I might have been arrested up in Baltimore with the Civic Interest Group. I'd been down to Rock Hill and taken into protective custody, but it went out on the wires that I had been arrested. For those who are younger, the old wire services, AP, UPI, they used to call that going out on the wire. So I sort of knew, and this was in the South. These were my people. I knew them. The reason I didn't go to school in Georgia was I was afraid I'd be looking in the face of a relative. You might have been looking into the face of one of my relatives.
But you said that even in the prisons or jails or wherever they had you, you were segregated. The whites were in one place, the black Freedom Riders were in another.
Oh yeah, segregation was segregation for everything. And I really felt more in common with the black ladies in the next cell over because we had all come out of the sit-in movement, and furthermore, they knew what grits were. We could communicate. But the idea had become fill the jails, and we did, and surpassed it. In the white women's cell at the high point or low point of Hinds County, we had less than 3 square feet of floor space per prisoner. Made sleeping interesting.
So what kept you going?
Pardon?
What kept you going? What kept you going? Why did you continue?
How could you turn back? Where could you go back to? There was no turning back. We'll never turn back because we can't or can't. And yeah, that was it. Jesus didn't turn back, Gandhi didn't turn back, and we sure weren't going to be any.
And what do you think was your biggest victory? If we had time, this would be a good time to sing Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, but we don't have time. What do you think your biggest victory was at the time? Your biggest victory?
My biggest victory. Just surviving, particularly on the Canton Road, just before the start of Freedom Summer. They were going to kill some of us. And thanks to Hamid Kisselbosh from Pakistan becoming an Indian, which took a lot of doing to let the Klan think he was an Indian, we survived. But as far as more traditionally in the movement, I think over across the river in Arlington, we'd been having sit-ins for a week or so, Howard students based right here on campus. And we sat in for about a week. Then we said, okay, we'll take a break. You all talk about it. We'll be back. And when we came back a week later, got those hamburgers. That was victory.
So at that point, you didn't have your focus on the Congress or trying to get the president to change the laws. It was local, right? Local.
It was
wherever you
local.
were.
We had seen about Brown versus Board of Education and how much effect the federal government had. Mm-hmm. So you got to take it to the streets. Power to the people.
Right. Thank you, Todd. I'm going to skip over you for a moment and go to Helen. When do you think you began your journey, which would ultimately lead to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, or was it after?
Well, I was 12 years old when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. But I knew as an Asian American child, the daughter of Chinese immigrants growing up in New Jersey, of all places, that watching these trailblazers, and may I say what an honor it is to be with my sheroes and heroes here, that you were blazing a path that affected me as a child. I grew up hearing people tell me to go back where I came from all the time, and I would have to say, but I'm in New Jersey, I'm here. You know, and seeing my parents ridiculed because of their accent, and when we moved into a community that the NAACP brought a lawsuit against to integrate, and that when my family moved in, eggs were thrown at our house too. And so I was very aware that what I saw on the news and television, and my father saying in America, a Chinaman's chance means no chance, that it was very clear that the struggles of the civil rights movement related every bit to me as an Asian American kid growing up in America, and that as a female, as an Asian American, as a lesbian who had to be married 3 times in order to have a legal marriage, thank you to this administration and the Supreme Court, and that there was no part of my life at all ever that wasn't touched by the civil rights movement, and I knew it. And so the thing about it, though, was being as an Asian American, especially in New Jersey, there was the narrative around civil rights was very clearly black and white. And for an Asian American, for Puerto Rican, Latino friends, we had no place to be part of this dialogue. In my high school, we had walkouts, teach-ins, and things like that around civil rights. And I remember standing in my schoolyard as a high school student, and we were all talking about our visions of an America where color, race, ethnicity didn't, we would be judged by the content of our character. And one of my friends turned to me and said, well, Helen, you've got to decide whether you're black or white. And I kind of stood there and looked at myself and thought, well, how am I going to do that? And that was at a time when Asian Americans wasn't even in the lexicon. You know, I was a Chinese American, I was, a foreigner, but not viewed as being an American. So it really was a struggle to even find a place in that dialogue. And that didn't really come up until I was in Detroit, Michigan. I went there to be part of the movements, labor movements, and to understand the heartland of America and what the civil rights movement really was about. And
You learned that in Detroit?
I ended up in Detroit, Big D, and I went there and got a job with Chrysler Corporation, worked in a stamping plant for a couple of years before I was laid off with, several million other people with the collapse of the American auto industry. And for those of you here old enough to remember those times, the hatred directed to Japan, Japanese automobiles, and anybody who looked like they were Japanese was intense. And it was really pretty much similar to after 9/11 and the attitudes toward Arab and South Asian Americans and Muslim Americans. And so there was a hate crime where a Chinese American was killed by 2 auto workers who said, and pardon my language, but they said, it's because of you motherfuckers that we're out of work. And out of that sprang a new American civil rights movement around Asian Americans.
And did you take the principles that had been demonstrated in the South to your campaigns?
Absolutely, we did. And the thing about it is the Asian American community is largely immigrant. Actually, it's more immigrant than the Latino community. And people didn't have an understanding of civil rights, but those of us who were American born and had grown up learning the lessons of the civil rights movement took it to the streets and also to the community, and part of the role of educating what this legacy was. And there was somebody from the Community Relations Service who came to Michigan, and by then we had a meeting of 200 people at the Ford World headquarters. The auditorium was like this and filled.
What year was that?
That was 1983. Mm-hmm. And so the question then was, for the broader society, are Asian Americans included in the civil rights to have civil rights protection? And actually the Michigan ACLU and the Michigan National Lawyers Guild said no. Asian Americans should not be covered by the civil rights movement. Asian Americans were not around in the 1980s, which wasn't true. And that we had nothing to do with civil rights, which also wasn't true, because so many Supreme Court cases like Yick-Wo was the basis of Brown versus Board of Education. And anyway, we had to argue that. We had to argue that to everybody. On Black-owned media stations, people said, well, what are you people? I mean, because we weren't viewed as Americans, and that was what we had to prove.
And at what point could you declare victory, if there came a point where you could?
I'm sorry?
At what point could you declare victory, if there came a point when you could?
Well, I think, as everyone has said, victory isn't there yet. There have been small victories, and one of the victories was when the U.S. Department of Justice Civil Rights Division actually did step in and conduct an investigation, because up until that point, there was really a question. Vincent Chin, the victim of the hate crime, was a naturalized American. We had to prove that he was a citizen, because had he not been a citizen at that point in 1983, the case might not have been taken up, because not only was he Asian, but he was also, viewed as being a foreigner. So would he be covered under the Civil Rights Act? And the victory was that the investigation happened. There was a civil rights trial, then it was appealed, there was another civil rights trial. Then I have to say, the idea that progress and civil rights and justice doesn't move in a straight line, in the end, his killers were acquitted. Because it's because of you motherfuckers we're out of work. There's no racial slur in there. And so there was a view that didn't have racist content. But the victory was each step along the way, and to be included, and to see the broadening of a view of what civil rights is.
Lisa Crooms Robinson, you are a very successful professor here at Howard University in the law school, but give us your journey that helped you embrace not only civil rights, but human rights and women's rights?
Well, it starts here, or it at least crystallizes here. Let me see, if we're going to do I was blank when the Civil Rights Act of '64 was signed.
I hear that often, but that's okay.
I was just under 2, okay, because my birthday's in November. So I can fully say that I benefited absolutely from what the Civil Rights Act of '64 enabled Brown to become. Similar to you, I started in New Jersey. So this is also a time where we commemorate the Newark rebellions. But then we headed south. And I also have the benefit of having not only been a page in the Georgia State Assembly, we talked about that a little earlier, thank you, in the 7th grade, but I also was the integrating factor in the North Fulton County public school system in Sandy Springs.
What year was that?
1976.
That was a long time after Brown.
It was a long time after Brown, but in Sandy Springs it really wasn't. It wasn't. And this is, for those of you all who know Atlanta now, the Sandy Springs of now is nothing like the Sandy Springs that my mother and I moved to. On Roswell Road, for example, one of the establishments was Lester Maddox's restaurant. He had a chain. And one of the things that they displayed in the restaurant was an axe handle, because apparently he made his mark threatening people with axe handles. That was the Sandy Springs that I was able to go 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th. But I was also a member of Ebenezer Baptist Church. So I lived Du Bois's 2 souls every week. So what did I do? I landed at Howard because I liked my Sunday soul better than my weekday soul. Got here in 1980. Ronald Reagan was just getting geared up. I was in the economics department here, so we spent a lot of time deconstructing trickle-down economics. And then I was introduced to the anti-apartheid movement.
On that was one of the things I wanted to pursue with you, because during my 16 years in South Africa and going in 1985, it was very clear that the U.S. civil rights movement had had an impact, at least in encouraging the resistance to apartheid there. Tell us about what, and also back in those days, I just learned when we were doing a book called In a Single Garment of Destiny, how Martin Luther King, even as he was primarily focused on civil rights in America, he also, and he talked about the beloved community, meaning the American community, he also talked about the global community. How do you see then the civil rights movement impacting globally, particularly in South Africa?
I think that, as you've noted, the imprint is fairly clear, but what's interesting, at least to me, is that it's an imprint of a movement that at some point in time was talked about in terms of being a human rights movement and was in fact envisioned as being a human rights movement. But because of Cold War politics, because of red baiting, and concerns about, let's say, institutional longevity and the ability of major institutions to continue to exist and survive the onslaught of the allegation of being communist or communist-oriented, that helps to explain why we have what we call a civil rights movement, but in any other country would be a human rights movement. So in many respects, the activism that we engaged in here tried to connect the two. We started looking at South Africa, but it was interesting, it was a conversation with Frank Chikane. At some point he was the former head of the South African Council of Churches. He came from South Africa to talk to the anti-apartheid activists, and he told the students point blank, the best thing you can do for us is to fight your own country's role in propping up apartheid. You need to struggle here. That's the best thing you can do for us. And many of us took it to heart, and we ended up turning our focus, but maintaining the internationalist sort of framework. So while we applaud the Civil Rights Act of '64, we know that the other side of rights, economic, social, and cultural, for example, seem to have been touched by the announcement of the war on poverty. But if you look at the two approaches taken by the two different laws, completely different discourse, completely different rhetoric, completely different outcome. So that much of what we now see as, let's say, class-based, but with a disproportionate impact or a disparate impact on communities of color, and in particular, women of color trying to raise their children, let's say in the context of what passes for social welfare programs right now, that because of the disconnect between what some might contend is the, at the very least, better rhetoric and scheme of the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the more problematic rhetoric and scheme that attached to the war on poverty, that in some places we have in fact created a situation where the most vulnerable and marginalized end up falling through the cracks. Because it's never just race, it's never just sex, and the Civil Rights Act of '64 clearly doesn't address class issues. We tried to do that with the war on poverty, but that has become so mean-spirited and about personal irresponsibility rather than this idea of societal obligation and all of us being part of this beloved community. So in many respects, we face a place where perhaps we need to imagine what that connection looks like as we, in fact, celebrate these two landmark pieces of legislation or executive efforts. Johnson declared the war on poverty and his commitment to pass the Civil Rights Act of '64 in the same State of the Union address. Let's take the lead from there and reconnect them, always keeping in mind that if we view things from the perspective of those who are most impoverished, those who are most marginalized, then it can only benefit the rest of us. If we take that approach, I think we'll make different choices, have different conversations, and maybe, let's say, the Voting Rights Act of, 2015, will take care of some of the more vulnerable folks who weren't imagined as being as vulnerable in light of the limited racial discourse that we were talking about. So let's get to Pennsylvania as well as Mississippi, rather than say we're focusing on Mississippi instead of Pennsylvania.
Well, clearly, thank you. Clearly, we've heard the Attorney General, we've heard presidents, we've heard other speakers talk about the fact that the journey that started in the '60s and even before, but particularly since 1964, it was a landmark, and many things happened subsequently, but even as President Barack Obama has talked about the preamble to the Constitution talking about a more perfect union, which goes to our Attorney General's remarks that the struggle continues. So Todd Burnham, let me get you into this discussion because you have followed, you've just finished a book on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What are some of the high points, and particularly address a little bit this Congress, which many people have talked about as well, not so much a progressive Congress. What was the term you used, Attorney General? You used a term about this, a courageous Congress. And since I'd like to bring this forward in the time that we have left, what is the tell us about the machinations in the courageous Congress. Were there many dissidents? And then bring us to today and compare the two Congresses, if you dare.
Well, I'm tempted to say there's a black and white difference, but the fact is that Congress and Presidents Kennedy and Johnson were moved to action by the work of people like Julian and Joan. And, you know, within the civil rights movement, there was some disagreement about what the best strategy to do was. The folks from Howard thought case-by-case legal, Thurgood Marshall, the strategy of careful strategic legal campaigns to get the courts to desegregate schools or law schools. And Roy Wilkins of the NAACP was deeply troubled by Dr. King's direct action campaign at times, and he challenged him one in the summer of 1963. I'd like to know what you have actually ever desegregated, Martin. And he said, I guess just a few human hearts. And it turns out that one of the hearts he'd had an action on was John Kennedy's, who by June of 1963 did propose the bill and couched it as a moral issue, as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution.
Thank you. I was going to quote that myself.
In the Congress of those days, there actually was a willing coalition of civil rights. We forget, but there were three parties in America in those days. There were the Republicans and the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, and that's how Congressional Quarterly kept track of them, because the divisions between the Southerners and the Northerners in the Democratic Party were so intense. So those people were paying attention to what their church groups were telling them, what their bishops were telling them, and they knew that the time had come to take some action on this. But there was a willingness to work across party lines, and one of the things that I had not really realized until I began my research, I knew the bill was bipartisan. I didn't realize how overwhelmingly bipartisan it was. It passed the Senate 73 to 27, with 27 out of 33 Republicans voting for it. And in the House, a totally forgotten figure, the crucial person in its passage, was a conservative congressman from West Central Ohio named William McCulloch. His hometown of Piqua is represented today by John Boehner. He was an opponent of gun control, of federal aid to education. He never spent more on a campaign than his congressional salary, and he turned back part of his office allowance every year because he thought it was wasteful. But his ancestors had been abolitionists before the Civil War, and he was a fierce supporter of civil rights. And in 1963, when the Kennedy administration proposed the bill, he said, I'll make a deal. If you promise to pass a strong bill all the way through the Senate, not water it down as they'd done in 57 and 60, and if you promise to give the Republicans equal credit going into next year's election, I'll bring along the House Republican caucus. And that's exactly what happened.
How much discussion was there? I mean, was there any behind-the-scenes stuff going on? Because I understand that President Johnson had a big role in twisting arms.
He did. He also, though, one of the things that I learned, he had to be very careful not to bring too much pressure to bear, because he knew his former colleagues in the Senate would resent it. So the White House tapes that he kept are actually bristle with his frustration with Hubert Humphrey and Mike Mansfield at the pace they set, and their willingness to let the debate go on, and let the Southerners exhaust themselves in talk, and let the dynamic shift in which the burden would then be on them to explain why they were tying up the country for 3 months in the Senate. And again, there's this extraordinary, I can only call it instances of grace. On the day that cloture was finally voted in the Senate, and the leader of the Southern opposition was your friend Dick Russell from Georgia, the person who walked him back to his office in defeat was Clarence Mitchell, the chief lobbyist of the NAACP. And he said, Clarence, you need to know that because this debate has been so prolonged and we've had our fair shake, I'll have to go home and say it's the law of the land and we have to obey it, and it'll be enforceable, and it'll be enforced overnight. And again, look at what happened with the Affordable Care Act. Look at the kind of rearguard action we see in the country now, trying to say that something is not a settled law even after the Supreme Court has upheld it. So I think the climate of the country was every bit as divided 50 years ago, but Washington was not as divided. And people knew each other. You have to be careful not to over-romanticize it, but they knew each other's families. Their children went to school together. They didn't live at home in their districts. And they drank. They drank all day long. And I'm sure that helped. I'm sure it helped.
What did they drink?
Distilled spirits. There's a famous story about Senator Dirksen, Everett Dirksen of Illinois, the Republican minority leader. He was the crucial compromiser for the Senate bill. And a young aide to Hubert Humphrey was in his office one day at about 11:30 in the morning and moved to pour himself a glass of what he thought was ice water from a crystal pitcher. And it was straight gin. And Senator Dirksen came in and took a big slug of it and went back on the Senate floor to do his business.
So what's the difference between then and now? Because we have a really fractious Congress and we have a divided America. I don't think anybody would disagree with that, would you? Okay, no.
Well, I think the districts, the whole structure of our politics is so different. You know, 60 years ago, political scientists concerned themselves with the fact that there was too much agreement in the American political system, and there should be more disagreement. And they thought the Eisenhower consensus was, not good for our democracy. I think we clearly have seen the results of, what the opposite can be. And as we know, every district is redder and redder and bluer, and people face a challenge not in November from the person of the opposite party, but from someone to the right or left of them. There's no incentive for compromise. There's no incentive for cooperation. I must also say there seems to be lacking personal courage, which clearly was in big supply 50 years ago.
Well, maybe they'll look at this online when it comes off and learn something from it. In the meantime, we have just a very few minutes left, And I want to talk about the younger generation. We're here at Howard, which is educating a large portion of the younger generation. When I go to schools and ask about how many know Martin Luther King, they raise their hands. How many know Rosa Parks, they raise their hands. And then I begin to name other activists in the civil rights movement and no hands raised. So what do you think of the younger generation today, the lack of that history, why they need to know it, and what we have to do as a generally generational, to encourage the kind of activism, or is this another time? And we have to really do this briefly. I'm sorry, my question was so long. Julian?
Well, you know, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center's Teaching Tolerance did a survey and found out that high school students know two names, Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and 4 words. And what are those 4 words? I have a dream. And that's all they know about the civil rights movement. And part of the reason is because most states don't require civil rights to be taught in schools. One of the states that does, by the way, is Mississippi. The states that do the best job in teaching civil rights are the states with the largest population of black people. That may be because they think they need it or they are expected or something. I'm not sure if this is good news or bad news. But anyway, it's not taught a great deal. And needs badly to be taught, and that can only happen if the people demand that it happen, as they have demanded that this bill be passed all these years ago. I'd be interested in Mr. Purdom talking about the role religious groups played, because it seems to me that's something missing today. But religious groups played an enormous role in passing this bill, and I don't see that kind of activism today.
Let me ask Joan very quickly. Joan, very quickly, what advice would you give to the younger generation? Are you encouraged by what you see among them? Briefly. Sorry, they're looking at me.
Be brief. The young folks, that includes college folks, have to define their issues, find their allies, consider the ripple effect, like casting the stone in the water and how far out the ripples go. I want to remind them there were 4 guys sitting in their dormitory in North Carolina who quit their complaining. They'd done enough of that, said, we're going to act. They sat down, leading to the more sitting down, freedom rides, community organization, the March on the Selma Bridge, the Voting Rights Act, we're skipping over the point of the day, the federal registrars, and on to the president, who has acknowledged this connection. So for the young folks, just find your cause and go do something. You don't know where it will lead. You just have to go for it.
Thank you, Joan. Todd?
Well, I do think, as Julian said, it's worth remembering the role that the religious groups had. I think we think of Dr. King and the SCLC. We forget the Methodists and Catholics and Jews and Baptists who got involved, and they put their pressure not in the big urban centers of the East where there were large black populations and strong labor unions. They worked on the Midwest and the Great Plains states where there were all these white Republicans who didn't have any interest or really particular reason to be for civil rights, but had a lot of churchgoers. And they did things like they had the Bishop of Dubuque call a particular senator, and Carl Munt of South Carolina said in the cloakroom one day, I hope that satisfies those 2 damn bishops who called me last night.
Okay, but today, what do we tell the young people?
Well, I wonder why. I think young people, in church groups all over the country, I wonder why the part of the evangelical movement that cares about economic justice isn't allied with the Catholic bishops on something like immigration. It seems to me like that would be a natural...
Helen, are you seeing the same kind of youthful activism? And if not, what are you encouraging young people today to do?
Well, I think one thing we can do, all of us, whether young or not so young, is to remember that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and all of the many laws and progresses we made are not, they're not just a stone cold inanimate object, but that they are living and breathing things just in the same way that our society is changing and living and breathing, and making the connections, for example, to look at, it's almost a cliche to say that our society is becoming more and more diverse, but that looking at Asian Americans or Latinos or lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people, and how we are all part of the civil rights movement, and for our own communities to educate people to understand what the shoulders are that we stand on. but also that to see things in new ways. When I got married and testified in the Prop 8 federal trial, one of the things that finally occurred to me was that I had never imagined that I could ever get married, and was in my head thinking that I would live forever as a second-class citizen, and accepted that this would never change. But then when it did change, I realized it was like always drinking out of that other water fountain and not knowing that the one that said heterosexuals only was actually cleaner and sweeter. And that's the kind of connection we have to make for ourselves as well as for the next generation, that what the next generation is fighting for is connected to the Civil Rights Act too.
Finally, Lisa.
Keeping in mind your request that we be brief, my advice to younger people, come to Howard.
I want to thank this amazing panel. I hope we have some more time backstage because I have so many more questions for them, but they've been wonderful. John Lewis did not speak at Howard University's graduation, but he did speak at a graduation this year, and his advice to the younger generation was, get in the way. I think that's a good message for all of us. Thank you.
Please welcome Montgomery High School student and rising senior, Ms. Blessed Sharif.
On the definition of hope, hope, one syllable, 4 letters, H-O-P-E. Noun, a feeling of expectation and desire, derived from Old English hop or hopian, meaning to wish, to expect, to look forward to. A word of German origin connected as well to the Dutch language, hope. A word with so many sounds, so many souls, it doesn't get by on just one syllable. It's the words of a man, a king with a dream. It's attached to the faces of the ones who are screaming for freedom. 4 letters, more like 6. And it's spelled like this, V-I-S-I-O-N. And do you see now what I mean? Where there is no vision, the people perish. We are a species defined by our progress, from the moment we climbed up off our knees and onto our feet. And we've been doing it ever since, off our knees and onto our feet. Hope, a noun in action. And whether we are shuffling, mumbling, or running at breakneck speed, it makes sure that we are moving. Hope, derived from the one who makes all things new, a spirit that lives on the inside like a wish, waiting to come true. It's true. We are made of stardust. So the next time you see a shooting star, turn around and look inside you. You're on fire. Know that only the things that burn are the things that last forever. Know that fire ignites, and we're called to leave this world in ashes, more beautiful than the icebergs before. Hope. A word which has its origins in the smile of a newborn child and in the spark of a newborn mind, which has the power to change a generation. And if there's one thing important enough to remember about what hope is, it's that H-O-P-E E stands for one thing, W-E, and that is we. We are hope.
Please welcome the Associate Attorney General of the United States Department of Justice, Tony West.
Thank you, and good afternoon. First, let me just say to Miss Blessed Sheriff, you are a hard act to follow. Thank you for sharing that inspirational poem with us. It is an honor to be with you this morning and to introduce our next speakers. But before I do, I just have to take a minute to say that being here, I can't help but think about my father. My dad was 72 when he passed last year, but when President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, my father was a rising senior at another HBCU, Talladega College in Alabama. Yeah, well, you can hear it for Talladega. And for him, that act represented a newer world, one that offered an alternative to the arbitrary restrictions of racial segregation that had defined his childhood growing up poor, without a father, working his grandparents' farm in rural Georgia where they labored as sharecroppers. And over the next 50 years, my father's life journey embodied both the purpose and the promise of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as he left the family farm and pursued an education, becoming the first in his family to go to college, as he left the Deep South and all that was familiar to him to raise a family in California, and as he built a successful career in business and in public service. Seizing the moment of opportunity that was created by that 1964 act, my father understood, as President Johnson recognized, that the words written into the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, those were promises. Promises that reached across generations and race and religion and ethnicity and gender to embrace people never intended by its authors to be beneficiaries. People like my dad and people like his family. Even as kids, my younger sisters and I, we knew that this nation was far from perfect, that it had erected barriers designed to constrain my father's success, to dampen his ambition and the ambition of others who look like him, who look like us. But Dad's experience taught us that in spite of all of that, there was an optimism and a faith that we could claim as our own about this country's possibilities. Dad taught us that the pledge to become a more perfect union, that wasn't esoteric or theoretical, that was a pact being made with and for us, his children, and his children's children. And that our responsibility was to embrace the opportunities that came with that promise as fully as we possibly could. That is the legacy of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And 50 years later, our work is to keep that spirit and purpose alive for this generation and for those to come. Because the challenge we inherit as we build the Civil Rights Act's next 50 years is how well we embrace the spirit of 1964 in today's fights against injustice and poverty, today's push for equal pay and freedom from gender-based violence, today's battles for LGBT rights and marriage equality. You see, the Civil Rights Act, it's a tree. It's a single tree rooted in the soil of equality with many branches, one movement with several offspring. And the best commemoration we here can offer is not to be satisfied with yesterday's change, but to harness the courageous spirit that created that 1964 act and to pay it forward in our own times. And today we are privileged to be joined by two national leaders who have worked tirelessly to pay it forward by devoting their lives to promoting justice, fairness, and equality. As the head of the Department of Education, Secretary Arne Duncan has long been a strong advocate for equality and civil rights. From the time that he was a child, growing up in his mother's after-school tutoring program on the south side of Chicago, up through his 7 years as CEO of the Chicago Public Schools and into his current role, Secretary Duncan has nurtured a deep commitment to equality of opportunity. He's partnered with Attorney General Holder and Labor Secretary Tom Perez on numerous initiatives to advance the cause of equity and civil rights. And he's no stranger to Howard. He's been here several times, even gave the commencement address here just 2 years ago, and we look forward to hearing from him shortly. But first, I am honored to introduce a colleague and a friend. Labor Secretary Tom Perez knows well the front lines of our ongoing fight to protect civil rights. Prior to his current position in the President's Cabinet, Secretary Perez served as the Assistant Attorney General of the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice, where he brought passionate leadership to the department's work against discrimination in housing, employment, the criminal justice system, and education, as well as to our efforts to safeguard every citizen's right to vote. Now he leads the Department of Labor, where he pushes to ensure that workers get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. We're fortunate he's working there, and we're pleased to have him here. Please join me in welcoming the Secretary of the Department of Labor, Tom Perez.
Good afternoon. You know, as a trained trial lawyer, you sit there and you listen to everybody, and you have your remarks, and you realize you got to call an audible. And so I'm going to call an audible, if you'll allow me to. It is so humbling to be here in the presence of the frontline generals in the movement, Ambassador Young and Julian Bond, whose cousin is one of our remarkable career employees in the Civil Rights Division, and Charlene and so many others who have been here. And so I want to first of all start by acknowledging that. I feel like I'm a student of the movement, and to be here in the presence of the generals is a remarkable opportunity, and to be here in the presence of my former boss and good friend Eric Holder, and I'm going to get to him in a minute. So I'm going to talk some about him. But I really want to take a step from what Charlene said and really talk to the young people in this room about the future, because you've heard some remarkable words about where we've been and where we've come, and we've talked some about where we need to go. But I remember vividly an editorial writer who asked me the following question when I was the head of the Civil Rights Division. And when he first asked it, I wasn't sure whether he was serious. And then the third or fourth time I got asked this question, I realized I needed to answer it. And his question was this: Tom, why do we need a Civil Rights Division? Because, we've come a long way. We've got Justice Sotomayor, we've got Eric Holder, we've got President Obama. We see so much progress. And why do we still need a Civil Rights Division? In the year, back, it was 2 or 3 years ago, I got asked this question. But the more I got asked this question, the more I realized I got to answer this question. And so for those of you who are thinking about a career in civil rights, let me give you a day or a week in the lives of the Civil Rights Division in the year 2011, in the year 2012, in the year 2013 today, so that you have a feel for where we are as a nation. And let's stipulate as we start that we have come such a long way, because it would be such a disservice to those who fought and in some cases made the ultimate sacrifice to suggest otherwise. But here's a day in the life. You know, I can't ever forget this case. It was one of the first cases we brought after the passage of the Matthew Shepard Byrd hate crimes law that the president signed in 2009. It was a case out of Arkansas. These white supremacists were so angry at the fact that Latinos had moved into their neighborhood that they went to a gas station where these Latinos were, and they started yelling things at them, and then they chased them out of there, and a car chase ensued, and they knocked them off the road, and the car flipped over multiple times. And one of the people was seriously hurt. And by the way, they were caught like 2 miles away because in their rush to go after the Latinos, they ran out of gas running away. You know, as prosecutors, sometimes luck is good. You know, let's just be honest about that. But their vitriol was such. This is America in the year 2011, 2012. Another case in New Mexico. 21-year-old Native American who's significantly developmentally delayed, and these white supremacists there come up to him, they lure him to their apartment, and they literally brand a swastika on him. Brand a swastika using a hanger. This is America and today. You know, I was in Meridian, Mississippi when I was AAG for Civil Rights, meeting with a group of African American kids in a school district, and they were sitting just like I am now, and I was sitting just like you are, Ambassador and Mr. Bond, and I was looking at their feet. That's what I was looking at. And every one of them had an ankle bracelet. They were 14 years old, and that's because they were all in the school to prison pipeline. And I asked them, what are you in for? One was wrong colored tie. One was the wrong colored socks. One was flatulence. I'm not making this up. This is Meridian, Mississippi. And today, where we still see separate and unequal, we see perhaps the most timeless continuing challenges in our voting context. Next year, we're going to come here to celebrate another 50th anniversary. We'll celebrate Bloody Sunday, and then we'll celebrate the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act of '65. And we thought we had made progress, and indeed we have. And John Lewis and so many others tell remarkable stories of the barriers that were overcome. And Title I of the Civil Rights Act of '64 is actually a voting title, but it didn't do enough. There was unfinished business. And so the next year they came on, and a remarkable piece of legislation. And where are we 50 years later? We're still litigating cases like Texas. Footnote 32, take a look at it. There is more evidence of discriminatory intent than we have the space or the need to discuss in this opinion. This is America in the year 2012. Talk to people like Colin Powell, who in the aftermath of North Carolina, their law, asked the question, if this voter fraud is so rampant, why is it so undetected? Colin Powell, hardly, a far left guy, but this is America in the year 2012. We have these timeless challenges, and then we have these emerging challenges, making sure, for instance, that when you're on a college campus, if you're a woman, you can be safe. We saw work in Montana, we see work around this country, and Artie Duncan, I'm sure, will talk about that. We see the challenges, and I will never forget, and I said I was going to get back to this guy, Holder, in a minute, and I'm going to get to him right now. I got a call one night, and it was from the AG. And he said, Tom, I want you to know that tomorrow we are going to be announcing that the president will be announcing that he is not defending the Defense of Marriage Act any longer as a result of decisions that I had made. Now, I like historians because historians get away from the noise. And when history judges this attorney general, and I'm talking to young people here, they're going to look at a person who understood the timeless challenges, that we needed to do something about the school to prison pipeline, that we need to do something about criminal justice challenges and the over-incarceration. You know, if the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, pretty soon everything starts looking like a nail. And he understood that, and he's doing stuff about that. And for me, that call I got that night was one of those 2 or 3 things that I remember most about our experience. Because when historians write about the evolution of the movement for equality, that was a seminal moment. That was the right thing to do legally and morally. And you know what? It got him in a little bit of soup. But you know what? I'll jump in that soup with him any day of the week, because that's who he was, this Attorney General. And so for those of you thinking about a career in this line of work, I want you to know that, you know, I wish I were the Maytag repairman, you know, waiting for that phone to ring and the phone ain't ringing. The phone continues to ring off the hook. And, you know, the thing about this movement, and the reason I love my current job and the reason I love my old job, is because the labor movement and the civil rights movement were one and the same. You know, when they marched on Washington, it was a march for jobs and it was a march for justice. And one of the best things that we can do, as Ambassador Young said, is empower economically our communities. And that's what I try to do day in and day out. That's what My Brother's Keeper is about. It's about expanding opportunity for everyone. It's about the moral notion that, you know what, everybody in this country is gifted and talented, and it's up to us to draw out those gifts and talents. There is no such thing as a spare American. That's what the civil rights movement's about. That's what the labor rights movement's about. And that's why I love my job. And that's what I hope that folk, you know, this work is a marathon relay. You know, the baton has been in Eric Holder's hand for a while, and he has sprinted this marathon. You're supposed to pace yourself, but he's been sprinting throughout this marathon. And you know what? The baton will be in your hands someday. And I hope one of the things you will take from this is what Dr. King said in that letter from the Birmingham jail. You know, when the folks were complaining that, you know, you're causing trouble here and you're creating tension, he said, as you well know, Ambassador, you know, I must confess, I am not afraid of the word tension. And I hope you will never be afraid of the word tension. And I hope you will never be afraid of the word compromise. Because if you study, as Todd Purdom and others have done, the history of the Civil Rights Act, that was a compromise. Didn't get everything. But you know what? You know, when Ben Franklin helped save the Republic, which was really troubled in 1787, that was a compromise. And yet today, that's become a 4-letter word. And as you know, Walter Isaacson, a historian of Ben Franklin, said, and it applies with equal force to the Civil Rights Act, you know, compromisers may not make for sexy results, but they sure make for great democracies. This Civil Rights Act of '64 has made for a great democracy. This Voting Rights Act of '65 has made for a better democracy. But laws are only as good as the leaders enforcing them. That's why we need you to stay involved. That's why we need you to emulate the example of Barack Obama and Eric Holder and John Doerr and Andrew Young and Julian Bond. You can be the inside guy, you can be the outside person. You can be so often involved in so many ways. So I hope you'll do that, because you know what? You know, I got a fake knee here. I had knee replacement 2 years ago. You know, I got a hop in my step in part because I had a knee replacement. But I've got a hop and step in part because we still have opportunity gaps across America. We still have way too many folk who, you know, for whom opportunity remains elusive. And as long as that remains, and I believe that is going to be here for a while, we continue to need your help. And I am confident that the young people, whether they're here or whether they're watching, because this institution, you know, whether it's Charles Houston, whether it's Thurgood Marshall, whether it's my friend Ike Leggett, so many people from this institution have led. That's why this is the perfect place to have this event. And I hope we will continue the spirit of Charles Houston and Thurgood Marshall and Eric Holder and Barack Obama and so many others. Thank you very much.
Please welcome the 9th United States Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan.
That's a tough act to follow. Please give another round of applause to Tom Perez for being such a great partner. I think, like him, I'll put away my speech and just talk for a moment. You've heard a lot of speeches. Before I go any further, too, please give another round of applause to our Attorney General, Eric Holder. Please stand up. I say one of the joys of being part of this team is getting to know your teammates. And I didn't know Tom Perez before getting here, didn't know Eric Holder before getting here. You guys have some sense of what they stand for in terms of policy. But their character as human beings, their commitment, their sense of urgency, and their humbleness, it's been remarkable to see the hard work. And Eric, like many folks, have been trial by fire. But his leadership, his sense of purpose, his clear sense of right and wrong has been extraordinary through good times and bad. Eric, thank you so much for your leadership and example of public service you set for all of us. This obviously is a momentous time to think and to reflect and to celebrate the extraordinary history. Legends, icons here and across the stage, thank you so much for giving us an opportunity to serve. And by any measure, I'm always focused on education. The progress we've made in the past 50 years is extraordinary, but by any measure, we have so far to go. And let me give you a little bit of a sense of that progress, but the gaps that we still have to fight to close. And lots of folks want to talk about the achievement gap, and I talk about the achievement gap, but I'm much more focused on what Tom talked about, the opportunity gap, and I want to talk about the courage gap and the action gap that we have to close. So we're thrilled that high school graduation rates are at all-time highs. We're thrilled that college going rates are at all-time highs. We're thrilled that Latino dropout rates have been cut in half. African-American dropout rates cut almost in half. College going rates, record highs. Celebrate that, enjoy it, recognize the extraordinary work that led to that, but we're not yet where we need to go. And I focus not just on the successes, I focus on the challenges. Graduation rate of 80%. But when you have 20% not graduating, we know what so many of those young students look like. And we know when you drop out of high school today, you're basically condemned to poverty and social failure. There are no good jobs out there. So how do we continue to challenge the status quo and create opportunity? Our civil rights data collection project has been huge in not just having anecdotes, but looking systemically across the country about what is happening well and what isn't happening. When you look at far too many of the schools where African-American, Latino students go to high school where they don't have sufficient access to AP classes, where they don't have sufficient access to calculus and physics and biology, how can our young people be prepared to be successful if what are now basic classes aren't there? We looked in states like Minnesota where something like 1 in 5 high schools didn't have high school counselors. When we think about the social and emotional issues that our young people are dealing with and the lack of access there. I'm a huge believer in early childhood education. Far too many children around this country don't have access to early childhood education. Some of my toughest conversations are with my colleagues around the globe, education ministers in other countries, relative to other industrialized nations. We rank something like 28 in access to early childhood education. And those ministers ask me why we in America don't care about our babies. And that's a hard question for me to try and answer. And that's why the President's push for preschool for all is so hugely important. We have to make sure that we're providing access. We have to make sure it's high quality. We also have to make sure we're challenging ourselves when what we're doing isn't good enough. One of the things that the Attorney General and I announced together was something that stunned me. I learned good things every day. I learned bad things every day. The school-to-prison pipeline that you've heard about and the Secretary Perez talked about, that starts in some of our communities with our 3- and 4-year-olds in preschool. I had no idea. And we know when that's happening, we know it's our young boys of color, black and brown boys. And to see that systemically 3- and 4-year-olds were being suspended and expelled, what could a 3- or 4-year-old do that would justify that? And if there's a challenge there, let's address it, let's bring in the parents, let's have the highest of expectations, but let's not start to put kids out of school at that age when we know eventually they'll be locked up. The Attorney General has been a great partner on school discipline and trying to move away from zero-tolerance policies to perpetuate those school-to-prison pipelines and think about restorative justice and peer juries And we've visited fantastic schools that historically had staggering rates of violence and discipline issues. But young people are now taking control of the culture themselves, taking control of the environment, and their leadership is leading to a safer climate and leading to a situation in which young people can be successful. And it's sort of a counterintuitive thing for many of us as adults, but the more we give up power, the more we empower others, often the better things are. And empowering teenagers to be part of the solution, having them control the environment, control the culture, be the leaders, listening to them, respecting them. When we do that, wonderful things happen for kids in communities where it didn't happen historically. So let's celebrate the progress, but let's continue to challenge the status quo every single day where we have to do it. Our Office of Civil Rights has done an extraordinary job. In a perfect world, maybe you wouldn't need an Office of Civil Rights anymore. We receive about 10,000 complaints a year. We receive complaints and have to resolve situations where districts are systemically telling special ed students that their GPA or their grade starts at a multiple of 0.69, starts below the average because they are special needs. Had to go to a principal and say you cannot not offer AP classes to black students because you think they can't be successful in AP classes. This is 2013, 2014, not 50 years ago. This is not history, this is not legacy, this is today. And so let's celebrate the progress. Let's continue to challenge each other to be great partners. Let's think through how we can give every child a chance to be successful. Education, I'm convinced, is the civil rights issue of our generation. If you can ride at the front of the bus, if you can drink from the same water fountain, but you cannot read, you are not truly free. If you cannot compete in a global economy, if you don't have the skills to be successful in a globally competitive economy, we are not setting you up to be successful. And our challenge today, our competition is not in the neighborhood or in the district or in the state. Our competition is children in India, in China, in South Korea, in Singapore. Our children are as talented, as smart, as entrepreneurial, as hardworking as children anywhere in the world. We have to give them the chance. Early childhood education, high expectations K-12, the chance to go on to college and be successful. And when we do that, we don't just help children, we help strengthen families, we help strengthen communities, and ultimately we help strengthen the nation. The final thing I'll say, we're sort of crossing a seminal moment in public education. Our department predicts that this fall, for the first time in our nation's history, our nation's public schools will be majority minority. Think about what this means. This is not the right thing to do for the black community, the right thing to do for the Latino community. This is the right thing to do for our country. And once we cross that Rubicon, we're not going to go back the other way. We're going to continue to move in this direction. So I want to thank, again, legendary leaders who are here for all of your service. I want to thank the next generation of students who are going to step up and take Attorney General's position and my position and lead us where we need to go. Let's celebrate what we've done. Let's celebrate the monumental accomplishments. But this is not a time to rest. This is not a time to sit back. And as I travel the country, I see amazingly inspiring things, and I see heartbreaking things as well. Last thing I'll say, I have to say it, I'm from Chicago. To see the levels of violence happening in Chicago is heartbreaking. It's the toughest thing that I dealt with as a superintendent there. We lost a child every 2 weeks due to gun violence, every 2 weeks. And the vast majority weren't gangbangers. This was a girl at 7:30 in the morning on a weekday in her living room, killed by an AK-47 from 100 yards away. This is another young girl at her birthday party. This is a young boy on the bus home at 2:30 in the afternoon shot. Our children, our communities deserve something better. And those actions come from a sense of hopelessness, not of hope. Young people with hope, with opportunity, don't behave in such self-destructive, such mutually destructive ways. So whether it's through My Brother's Keeper, whether it's through the Promised Neighborhoods Initiative, whether it's all of our work collectively, we have to give our young boys and our young boys of color a sense of hope, a sense that there is a future for them, mentors, role models. And if you believe you're going to die at 16, 17, 18, you live a very different life than if you believe you're going to live to be 65 or 70 or 80 or 90. And so I just challenge all of us to be self-critical, to look in the mirror and say, what can we do to create a climate in which our young boys aren't out there 13, 14, 15, 16, killing each other. They deserve better. Our nations deserve better. Our families deserve better. Thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you for challenging us. Together, we have to get this done. Thank you so much.
Now performing I've Been Buked and Lift Every Voice and Sing, under the direction of Dr. James Weldon Norris, please welcome to the stage the Howard University Choir.
Lay harmonies of liberty. Let our rejoicing rise high as the listening skies. Let it resound loud as the rolling seas. Sing a song full of the faith that the dark past has taught us. Sing a song full of the hope that the present has brought us. Facing the rising sun of our new day begun, let us march on till victory is won. Stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, felt in the days when unborn had died, yet with a steady beat, have not our weary feet come to the place for which our fathers sighed. We have come over a way that with tears has been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughtered. How from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the bright gleam of our bright star is cast. God of our weary years, God of our silent tears, thou who hast brought us thus far on the way, thou who hast by thy night led us into the light, keep us forever in the path we pray. Lest our feet stray from the places, our God, where we met thee, lest our hearts, drunk with the wine of the world, we forget thee. Shadow beneath thy hand, may we forever stand, true to our God, true to our native land.
Thank you. Please be seated. Please welcome the District of Columbia's representative in Congress, Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you very kindly. Now, you have just heard the best university choir in the United States of America. I want to thank President Frederick for this extraordinary commemoration. It's a great act. It's a great civil rights act. It deserves a great ceremony, and that is what we have had today. I want to thank the very distinguished cabinet and other important officials who have appeared today, the Attorney General of the United States, the cabinet members who preceded me, and especially the people from the movement who are here Ambassador Young, my own peers and friends from the movement, Charlene Hunter Galt, and Julian Bond, from the movement that made the 1964 Civil Rights Act happen. I dare say that President Johnson himself would have desired this ceremony, would have thought it was in the appropriate place. Because President Johnson understood that the flagship university of Black America was the place to come to send a message to the nation about equality for the nation. I simply want to put this extraordinary year in some context. I see the year 1964 as the year of beginnings. 50 years ago, on July 2nd, the nation began the most extraordinary cycle of human rights lawmaking since the Civil War. Just think of it. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Fair Housing Act, 3 great civil rights statutes in fewer than 5 years. I'm a member of the House of Representatives. And if we have one significant statute out of this House, I will have to regard that as historic for this year. That was the year as well when the residents of the nation's capital, who I now have the privilege to represent in the Congress, cast their first vote, the first in the history of the Republic for the residents of this capital, for President of the United States. These beginnings will be measured by the progress and setbacks for the 1964 Civil Rights Act and for the District of Columbia by just how long taxation without representation endures in this country. The 1964 Civil Rights Act did not just happen. It responded to 10 years of demonstrations in the South. It responded by barring discrimination in public accommodations, in schools, and in employment, all in one act. The act also removed the federal government from its deep complicity in discrimination by preventing federal money from being used to aid discrimination. The high point of the act, however, was the first enforceable civil rights discrimination law since the Civil War, and especially its centerpiece, Title VII, the job discrimination provision. That was the year I graduated from law school, a third-generation Washingtonian and a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the thick of the Civil Rights Movement. At the same time, my own city was without even the right to elect a local government or a member of Congress. Who knew that little more than a dozen years later, I would be administering and enforcing the job discrimination law I'd been in the streets and in the South demanding. I returned to the South last month for another 1964 commemoration, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, which attracted 1,000, mostly white students from throughout the country in the summer of 1964. They exposed the South's brutal violation of the rights of African Americans, and as a consequence, 3 of the students, Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner of New York and James Chaney of Mississippi, lost their lives. The seeds for passage of the Voting Rights Act the following year were sown. By the end of that eventful 1964 summer, Black and white Mississippians had formed themselves into a political force to challenge the segregated Mississippi delegation to the 1964 National Convention. My first brief was not to a court, but this newly minted lawyer's first brief was to the Credentials Committee of the 1964 Democratic Convention, seeking to unseat the segregated traditional delegation to the 1964 convention. The Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party began the process of democratizing our political parties and the conventions that choose the nation's nominees for President of the United States. I smiled, oh how I smiled, as I returned to Mississippi last month, just after Black voters had saved Senator Thad Cochran's seat from a Tea Party Republican whose campaign had been laced with racial animosity. This year, all year, we should be celebrating the 1964 Civil Rights Act, signed by a great president, Lyndon B. Johnson. But the year itself deserves its own celebration. It was the year of beginnings, not yet finished. It was the year when, using the rule of law, the nation began to solve its oldest domestic problem, and if I may say so, to be continued. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for sharing this monumental occasion with Howard University and the Department of Justice.